The wind, as always, was the first and last voice of Dry Creek. It said nothing kind. It spoke of grit and endings, of alkali dust that coated every surface and settled in the lungs like a prophecy of the grave. It had been blowing for 3 days, a steady, whining reminder that God had forgotten this patch of the American West sometime around the 1870s and had not seen fit to look back. The town itself was a scar on the flat, cracked land. It was a single wide street of false-fronted buildings, their paint blasted away by sun and sand until the raw wood beneath looked like bone. 3 structures gave the town its spine, such as it was the First Presbyterian Church, white and severe at one end, the dusty Spur Saloon, loud and smelling of sour beer at the other, and precisely in the middle, the sheriff's office, which also served as the jail, its barred window a single, square, unblinking eye. Power in Dry Creek was a 3-legged stool, and 2 of the legs, the saloon and the church, were always trying to kick the 3rd one out from under the law. Clara Whitford knew the wind's voice better than any preacher's. It was the soundtrack to her widowhood. She stood on the porch of her ranch house, 5 miles from town, and watched the dust devils dance across her failing pastures. The ranch had been Jacob's dream, a place to raise horses that were fast and strong, horses with good bone and big hearts. Now it was her burden. She was a tall woman, made of straight lines and angles that the land had not yet managed to wear down. But it was trying. Her hair, once the color of dark honey, was pulled back so tight it made her temples ache, and strands of it had come loose to whip across her face, stinging her skin. Her hands, resting on the porch rail, were not the hands of a lady. They were chapped, the knuckles split, the nails broken. They were the hands of a woman who did a man's work and a woman's worrying, all by herself. Inside the quiet house, the silence was as thick as the dust. It had been 1 year, 2 months, and 11 days since Jacob had been thrown from the big bay stallion he was breaking, his neck snapping with a sound like dry kindling. The stallion, spooked by a rattlesnake, had run itself lame and had to be shot. Clara had lost both her husband and her best breeding stock in the space of 10 minutes. Now, all she had left was the silence. 3 mares of questionable lineage, a half-wild colt, and the debt. The debt was the ghost that sat at the supper table with her every night. A note at the bank in town, signed by Jacob, co-signed by her, and held by a man who had no patience for widows who fell behind on their payments. Dale Morrison owned the bank. He also owned the dusty Spur Saloon, the Mercantile, and pretty much every patch of decent grazing land for 50 miles in any direction. He was a man who collected things: land, businesses, favors, and fear. He had a big, friendly laugh that never reached his eyes, and he had already made Clara 2 offers for her ranch. Both were insults. Both were delivered with a smile that made her skin crawl. He wanted her water, what little there was of it, and he knew she was running out of time. The banknote was due in 30 days. She turned from the rail and went inside, the screen door slamming shut with a weak, familiar thud. The house smelled of old wood smoke and lonely coffee. She had to go to town for flour and salt, a trip she put off as long as she could. Town meant seeing the pity in some eyes and the speculation in others. It meant seeing Dale Morrison. She saddled her remaining riding mare, a dun-colored creature with a Roman nose and a wary eye. As she rode, the landscape offered no comfort. The drought had sucked the color from everything, leaving a world of brittle browns and pale, washed-out blues. The buzzards circled high overhead, patient as bankers. Dry Creek was stirring into its midday lethargy when she arrived. She tied the mare in front of the Mercantile, avoiding the gaze of the Harmon brothers. They were lounging on the boardwalk outside the saloon, as they always were. Cal and Ike Harmon were Morrison's muscle, 2 sides of the same blunt instrument. They were big, shiftless men who wore their guns low and their malice plain. They stopped talking as she passed. their eyes following her, and Ike spat a brown stream of tobacco juice that landed just inches from the hem of her worn skirt. Clara kept walking, her back straight, her chin high, her stomach churning. Inside the mercantile, Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor's wife, gave her a tight-lipped nod. The air was thick with the smell of pickles, bolt cloth, and coffee beans. Flour and salt. Mrs. Whitford. Please, Mrs. Patterson, and a small bag of arbuckles, if you have it. Running low on most everything, the woman said, her voice flat. This drought and other troubles? She glanced pointedly toward the window. In the direction of the sheriff's office, a small crowd was gathering. Not a big crowd, but a mean-spirited one. Clara felt a knot of apprehension. What troubles? Clara asked, though she was not sure she wanted to know. That Apache they brought in? Mrs. Patterson said, leaning closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Sheriff McKenna caught him with 2 of Morrison's best horses? Red-handed. Imagine the nerve. Clara's blood ran a little cold. Any dealing with Indians in this territory was bad business. The resentment was still fresh, the so-called wars barely over. What will they do with him? Sheriff's holding a labor auction, noon, to pay Morrison back for the horses. Though, if you ask me, a rope would be quicker and cleaner. Reverend Blackwood said as much in his sermon Sunday last. He said the heathen savage is a blight on a decent, God-fearing town. Reverend Blackwood, the third leg of the stool. His church was the cleanest building in town, and his sermons were famous for being long on damnation and short on mercy. He was a thin, pale man with eyes that seemed to look right through you, tallying your sins. He was also, Clara knew, a frequent guest at Dale Morrison's dinner table. She paid for her goods, the coins feeling heavy and few in her palm. Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Outside, the crowd by the sheriff's office had grown. Curiosity, black and ugly, pulled her toward it. She told herself she was just waiting for the Harmon brothers to move on, but she knew it was a lie. She drifted to the edge of the assembly, staying near the back. Sheriff McKenna stood on the steps of his office. He was a decent man, or as decent as a man could be in his position. He was caught between the law he had sworn to uphold and the power of Dale Morrison, who paid his salary and held the mortgage on the town itself. McKenna looked tired, his face grim under the brim of his hat. All right, folks, settle down, he called out, his voice rough. This ain't a circus. But it was. They brought the prisoner out. Clara had seen Apache before, mostly from a distance. Shadows moving through the high desert. This one was not a shadow. He was terribly real. He was not tall, but he was built with a lean, spare power, like a whipcord. He wore only a breechclout and ragged moccasins. His hands were bound in front of him with rope. His black hair hung long and loose, matted with dirt. There were bruises on his face, a split lip, and a long, raw abrasion on his cheekbone. He looked half-starved, but he was not cowed. He stood perfectly still as the crowd jeered and shouted. His eyes, dark and sharp, scanned the faces, missing nothing, giving nothing. There was an intelligence in that gaze, a sharpness that cut through the labels savage, heathen, thief. This was Naochi Cowboy, though no one in the crowd knew or cared about his name. To them, he was just the Apache. To the soldiers who had burned his village and forced his people onto the reservation at San Carlos, he had been a nuisance. To the scouts who had hunted him, he was known as Talon for the way he fought and the way he saw things from a distance. Now, he was just a piece of property, framed for a crime he had not committed, a pawn in one of Dale Morrison's games. He had been found on Morrison's land. True, but he had been tracking the men who had actually taken the horses, the Harmon brothers themselves, a fact he knew would never be spoken or believed. This man, Sheriff McKenna began, his voice devoid of all enthusiasm, has been found guilty of the theft of 2 horses, property of Mr. Dale Morrison. Morrison himself was standing at the front of the crowd, looking solemn and magnanimous, like a man forced to do his civic duty. He nodded gravely at the sheriff. Mr. Morrison has graciously agreed. McKenna continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. To forego a trial and hanging, provided the debt to him is paid. The court values the horses at $70. We will therefore auction this man's labor for a period of 1 year to the highest bidder. The $70 will be paid to Mr. Morrison. Do I have an opening bid? A heavy silence fell. This was not a slave auction. They told themselves, this was the frontier. This was justice. But the air felt thick and wrong. $10! Shouted a voice. It was Cal Harmon. He and his brother were laughing. I bid $10 for the savage. We can use him at the saloon, swabbing floors. 15, yelled another man, a miner with a mean streak. He can haul rock. Reverend Blackwood watched from the steps of the church, his arms folded, his face a mask of pious approval. Clara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the man, Talon, flinch almost imperceptibly as the bids rose. $20. 25? She saw the quiet, burning dignity in the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself against the wave of hatred. She thought of her ranch. She thought of the failing fences, the colt that needed breaking, the well that was threatening to go dry. She thought of the unending work, the exhaustion that went bone deep. She thought of the 30 days she had left. And then she thought of Jacob. Jacob, who had always said, you do not judge a man by the color of his skin, Clara, or a horse by the color of its hide. You judge him by the look in his eye. She looked at Talon's eyes. She saw pain. Yes, she saw rage, held on a tight leash. But mostly she saw a man, just a man, who was being torn apart by dogs. She clutched the small leather pouch at her waist. Inside was the money from the sale of her mother's silver locket, plus every spare cent she had scraped together for the past 6 months. It was her flour and salt money, her seed money, her emergency money. It was all she had left in the world. $75. Meant to buy just a little more time from the bank. $30, Cal Harmon shouted, grinning at his boss. Morrison gave a small, indulgent nod. Clara felt the word rise in her throat before her brain could stop it. It was madness. It was ruin. $50, she said. Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the masculine rumble of the crowd. Every head turned, every eye fixed on her. The Harmon brothers gaped. Sheriff McKenna's jaw dropped. Dale Morrison's pleasant smile faltered, a flicker of genuine surprise, and then annoyance. Crossing his features, Talon's head moved, just an inch. His dark eyes found hers. He did not look grateful. He did not look relieved. He just looked. He saw her. $50. Cal Harmon sneered, recovering. What's a widow woman want with an Apache buck 55? 60, Clara said, her voice louder now. She stepped forward, out of the shadows of the boardwalk. 65, Harmon yelled, his face turning red. The crowd was buzzing now. This was better than a hanging. This was drama. $70, Clara said, her gaze locked on Sheriff McKenna. She did not look at Morrison. She would not give him the satisfaction. A silence fell, taut and absolute. $70 was the price. Cal Harmon looked at Morrison for instructions. Morrison's face was a polite mask, but his eyes were cold as stones. He gave a tiny, almost invisible shake of his head. The sport was over. $70, Sheriff McKenna said. A strange note of something was at respect in his voice. Sold to Mrs. Clara Whitford. Clara Whitford, owner of a failing ranch, haunted by the ghost of her husband and the specter of the bank, had just spent the last of her money. She had bought a man, or, she thought, as she met the unbroken, challenging gaze of the Apache warrior, She had just set them both free. The themes of the frontier, of dignity and prejudice, land and memory, had just found their battleground, and it was her. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the small, grim crowd. Sheriff McKenna had finished his speech, the words hanging in the dry. Noon air, hollow and official. He was a man doing a job he clearly despised, but he was doing it all the same. "Bidding starts at $10, he called out, gesturing to the man standing bound on the steps. $10, Cal Harmon's voice boomed from the front row, full of cheap whiskey and malice. He grinned at his brother Ike, who spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. 15, a miner shouted from the back. Dale Morrison, standing near the sheriff, did not bid himself. He did not need to. He raised his voice in that reasonable, friendly tone he always used, the one that made everyone feel included in his plans. "Just so you all know, gentlemen, whoever takes this contract, my new mining operation up on the North Ridge could surely use a strong back, hard, honest work." He smiled. "We would be prepared to buy the contract for, say, $25, a quick profit for a civic-minded citizen." The crowd murmured. They all knew what hard, honest work in Morrison's unbraced shafts meant. It was a year-long death sentence. Reverend Blackwood, standing in the shade of the boardwalk, nodded his pious approval. "Labor purifies the soul, gentlemen," he intoned, his voice thin and reedy. "Scripture tells us to toil for our sins. Even a heathen soul can be scoured clean by the sweat of his brow." He was painting Talon as a spiritual threat, a thing to be broken and cleansed. 25, the miner shouted, catching Morrison's drift. 30, Cal Harmon countered, his eyes on his boss. He was enjoying this. 35, the miner shot back. Cal Harmon opened his mouth to bid again, but a new voice cut through the air. It was not loud, but it was clear, and it was female. $70. The word, the amount, the very idea of it, struck the crowd dumb. The bidding stopped, the jeering stopped. Every man turned, their necks craning, their mouths slightly open. Clara Whitford was pushing her way through the press of bodies. She had been at the back, almost hidden, but now she emerged, her face pale under her bonnet but her eyes blazing with a light that no one in Dry Creek had ever seen before. She did not stop until she was at the front, standing directly before the steps, her worn handbag clutched in her hands. Cal Harmon was the first to find his voice. "What in blazes, it's the widow." Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, his face a mask of shocked disapproval. "Mrs. Whitford, this is madness. It is unbecoming. This man is a savage, a thief, a danger to a decent woman." Clara ignored him. She ignored the gasps from Mrs. Patterson and the other women on the boardwalk. She ignored the stunned, furious look on Dale Morrison's face, his friendly mask completely gone, revealing the cold granite beneath. She looked directly at Sheriff McKenna, who looked as if he had been punched in the gut. Her voice trembled, but it did not break. "Sheriff, I have the money." She paused, and her gaze flickered for just a second, to the man standing bound. He was watching her, his dark eyes unreadable, but absolutely focused. "I see a man worth saving." If her bid had stunned them, her words struck them like a physical blow. A widow, defending an Apache, calling him a man. It was an obscenity to them, a fundamental challenge to the way their world was built. In the stunned silence, a young man standing near the edge of the crowd, Tom Bradley, son of Dr. Bradley, watched the scene with a sudden, sharp clarity. His father, the doctor, was watching with a kind of clinical detachment, as if observing a strange new illness. But Tom saw something else. He saw the sneering, ignorant faces of the Harmon brothers. He saw the naked, controlling anger on Dale Morrison's face. And he saw the quiet, desperate courage of this lone woman. He looked at the Apache, who had not flinched, had not begged, had not shown anything but a terrible, contained dignity. For the first time in his life, Tom Bradley felt a hot, confusing shame for his town. Sheriff McKenna swallowed, his throat dry. He looked at Morrison, who gave a slight, furious shake of his head. But the bid was legal. The money was offered. McKenna was a man of procedure, and it was his only shield. $70, he said, his voice a hoarse croak. Going once. No one spoke. The silence was absolute. Going twice. He looked at the crowd. Sold. He slammed his hand down on the wooden rail of the steps. To Mrs. Clara Whitford. For a moment, Clara just stood there, the tension draining out of her, leaving her weak-kneed. Then she forced herself to move. She walked up the 2 steps, the crowd parting for her as if she carried the plague. She opened her worn leather handbag. With steady hands, she counted out the coins, silver dollars, a few gold half-eagles, coins she had saved, coins that meant survival. $70. Every last cent she had in the world. The sound of the metal dropping into Sheriff McKenna's palm was the sound of a door slamming shut on her future. McKenna took the money, his face grim. He quickly scribbled on a piece of paper from his pocket. This here document states you have purchased the labor of this prisoner, name unknown, for a period of 1 year, for the sum of $70, paid in full to satisfy the debt to Mr. Morrison. He is your responsibility, Mrs. Whitford. Do you understand? I understand, Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. McKenna nodded to his deputy, a young, nervous man named Peters. Unlock his legs. The deputy fumbled with the large iron key, his hands shaking as he knelt at the prisoner's feet. The heavy iron shackles were old and rusted. He struggled for a moment, and then the lock clicked open. The heavy circlet fell away from Talon's right ankle, and then the left. They hit the wooden steps with a dull, final thud. Talon did not move, but he rolled his ankles slightly, the first free movement he had been allowed in days. The wrist binds stay on, McKenna said gruffly. To Clara, they stay on until you are clear of town property. Understood. Understood, Clara said. Talon looked at her. It was a long, assessing gaze. He was looking at this strange white woman who had just thrown her life away for him. He saw her fear, but he also saw the resolve that held it in check. He was a man who understood survival, and he recognized it in her. He gave one sharp, silent nod. It was not submission. It was an acknowledgement. He would follow. Clara turned and, without looking at anyone, began to walk down the steps. The crowd parted for her again, a sea of hostile, unbelieving faces. As she passed Dale Morrison, he stepped into her path just enough to make her pause. He did not touch her. He did not raise his voice. He spoke in a low, civilized hiss that was far more threatening than any shout. You will regret this, widow. Clara met his cold eyes. She felt the hatred coming off him, the fury of a man who had been denied his prize. I regret a great many things, Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice just as quiet. This will not be one of them. She stepped around him and kept walking. She walked the length of the main street, her head held high, her back straight. Talon followed 3 paces behind, his wrist rope stark and white against his skin, his moccasins making no sound on the dusty boardwalk. They were a strange, impossible pair, the respectable widow in her worn gray dress, and the Apache warrior, bruised and half-naked, following her like a dog on a leash. The town watched them go. They watched from the windows of the mercantile, from the doors of the saloon, from the steps of the church. Every eye was a judgment. Every stare was a stone. Clara felt them on her back, but she did not turn. She had crossed a line. She had chosen a side, and it was the side of this one, broken, silent man. She reached her mare, still tied in front of the mercantile. Her small bags of flour and salt were already strapped behind the saddle. She untied the reins. her hands functioning from memory. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung herself up. From the saddle, she looked down at him. He was standing by the horse's head, waiting. His face was an unreadable mask of dirt and bruises, but his eyes were alive, watchful, and intelligent. He was her responsibility. The seeds of an alliance were sown in that moment, in the shared fire of the town's hatred. It was an alliance born not of trust or friendship, but of necessity and a shared, unspoken understanding of loss. Respect from her, in seeing a man worth saving. Acknowledgement from him, in his willingness to follow. But there was caution in his eyes, and there was a deep, cold fear in her stomach. "You will walk behind," she said. It was not an order, but a statement of fact. He nodded once. Clara Whitford turned the mare's head toward the open, unforgiving prairie, toward her failing ranch, and rode out of Dry Creek, the silent warrior walking in her dust. The 5 miles from Dry Creek were a silent education in heat and dust. Clara rode the mare at a steady walk, a pace she calculated the man behind her could maintain without distress. She did not look back. Not once. She had made a spectacle of herself, a fool of herself, and perhaps a pariah of herself. Looking back would only show her the town she had just alienated, shrinking in the distance, and she was not strong enough to see that yet. She focused on the rhythm of the mare's hooves, the creak of the saddle leather, the burning sun on the back of her neck. Behind her, Naochi Kawe, called Talon, walked. His feet, protected only by thin, worn moccasins, made no sound on the packed, dry earth of the road. He kept a perfect, measured distance of 3 paces behind the horse's tail. Not closer, not farther. He walked with his head up, his gaze constantly moving, scanning the flat horizon, the heat-shimmering rocks of the low hills, the sky. He was a prisoner, bound at the wrists, walking into an unknown captivity. Yet he moved with the awareness of a free man. He was assessing the land, her land, with an expert eye. Clara felt his gaze on her back, on the ranch itself as they approached. It was a humiliating thing. To bring him here, she had, in her grand gesture, saved him from Morrison's mine, only to bring him to this monument of her own failure. The ranch came into view, and it was worse than she remembered. Seen through the eyes of a stranger, it was a ruin. The long line of the pasture fence was a joke, a series of leaning, drunken posts connected by sagging wire. The gate hung from one hinge. The vegetable garden patch near the house was a square of cracked, pale dirt, the withered skeletons of last month's beans rattling in the wind. The barn, Jacob's pride, had a hole in its roof the size of a wagon wheel, and several of the siding boards were missing, leaving black, gap-toothed shadows. The house itself, small and built of raw timber, seemed to be sinking into the dust, its porch boards warped, its whitewash long since blasted away. She rode the mare straight to the well, which stood between the house and the barn. She dismounted, her limbs stiff and aching. She did not look at him, but she was aware of his every movement as he stopped a few feet away. She took the metal bucket from its hook on the wellhead and worked the pump handle. The pump squeaked, a high, desperate, thirsty sound. It groaned and complained. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, a pathetic trickle of brown, gritty water spattered into the bucket. She kept pumping, her shoulders straining, until she had a few inches of the sludge. It was enough to water the mare, but not much else. The well was failing. It was the ranch's heart, and it was dying. She offered the bucket to the mare, who drank gratefully but with suspicion. Talon watched the pump, his expression unreadable. Clara dropped the handle, the sound a dull clang in the heavy silence. She could not meet his eyes. This was his new prison, a place of dust and broken things. She had paid $70 for the right to bring him here. She took a breath, forcing the shame down. The mare needs to be unsaddled. She led the horse toward the barn, her boots kicking up small puffs of alkali. He followed. The interior of the barn was dim and hot, smelling of old, dry hay, horse, and the fine dust that filtered through the broken roof. It was cooler than the outside, but only just. 3 empty stalls lined one wall. A workbench covered in Jacob's tools stood against the back wall, each tool hanging on a nail, coated in a fine, undisturbed layer of gray. Clara tied the mare's reins to a post and began to work on the cinch, her fingers fumbling with the stiff leather. She was suddenly, acutely aware of him. He was a man. She was alone. The town's leering questions echoed in her head. But when she finally, nervously, glanced at him, he was not looking at her. He was looking at the tools. "Wait here," she said, her voice too sharp. She hurried to the workbench and rummaged in a rusted coffee can full of old nails, bits of wire and junk. Her fingers closed around what she was looking for, a small, sharp-bladed knife, one Jacob had used for whittling. She turned. He had not moved. He was standing in the center of the barn, the light from the door silhouetting him, the ropes on his wrists stark and white. This was the moment. She walked toward him, the small knife held in her hand. He tensed. She saw it in the muscles of his shoulders, the way his eyes narrowed. He was a coiled spring, ready to fight, ready to die. "Hold still," she said, her voice dropping, trying to sound calm. "I am not going to hurt you." He did not relax, but he did not move. She had to get close to him, closer than she had been to any man since Jacob. She could smell the sweat and the dirt on him, a raw, man scent, and beneath it, something else, something like the wild sage that grew in the high rocks. She reached for his hands. He did not pull away. His skin was hot, dry. The rope was cinched cruelly tight, biting into his flesh. The skin around it was raw and bleeding. "The deputy tied this," she murmured, more to herself, her anger a brief, hot flare. She slipped the blade of the knife between the rope and his skin, her fingers brushing his. It was a slow, awkward process. She was terrified the knife would slip, that she would cut him. He remained perfectly, unnaturally still, his breathing the only sound in the barn. The first loop of the rope parted with a soft snick, then the second. The bindings fell away, dropping into the dust at his feet. He did not move for a long second. Then, slowly, he pulled his hands apart. He flexed his fingers, wincing as the blood rushed back into them. He raised his hands and looked at them. Not at her. He rubbed his wrists, his thumbs massaging the raw, red grooves where the rope had been. It was the most profound gesture of freedom Clara had ever witnessed. It was a quiet, private moment, and she felt like an intruder. She stepped back, the small knife still clutched in her hand. He let his hands drop to his sides. He looked at her. His eyes were not grateful. They were not angry. They were just deep. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and said too little. Clara cleared her throat, forcing the air from her lungs. The practicalities were her shield. "There is food. There is a place to sleep. You will work. I paid for 1 year. You will work to fix this place. Do you understand?" He looked around the barn, at the hole in the roof, at the broken stalls, at the light streaming through the missing boards. Then his gaze traveled to the open barn door, to the leaning fences and the dead garden beyond. He looked back at her. He nodded once, a single sharp dip of his chin. The agreement was made. It was a contract spoken in simple words, but its meaning was complex and deep. She was offering sustenance, not kindness. He was offering labor, not servitude. It was, for both of them, a desperate bid for dignity. He did not wait for her to give him an order. His gaze went back to the workbench. He walked over to it, his moccasins silent. He stood for a long moment, just looking at the tools. Then, he reached out and took down a heavy claw hammer. He tested its weight, swinging it lightly in his hand. He ran his thumb over the smooth, worn wood of the handle. He put it back on its nail and picked up a hand axe. He sighted down the handle, checking its balance. His movements were economical, precise. This was a man who understood tools. He was not just a warrior. He was a maker. He left the barn, not asking permission. Clara followed him, her heart thumping in a strange, new rhythm. He walked to the garden patch and knelt. He scooped up a handful of the pale, dead soil. He rubbed it between his fingers, smelling it, his expression thoughtful. He let the dust trickle from his hand. He walked to the fence line, to one of the leaning posts. He grabbed it and shook it. The wood was rotten at the base. He studied the sagging wire, then looked out at the vast, empty pasture. He turned and looked at the ranch house, at the barn, at the well. He looked at the whole, broken, dying place. He turned back to Clara, who was standing on the porch, watching him, her stomach in knots. He still had not spoken, but his assessment was clear in the way he stood. It was not a look of despair. It was a look of calculation. He was measuring the scale of the work. He was a man looking at a problem to be solved. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the western sky in bruised colors of orange and purple. The wind died down, as it sometimes did at sunset, and the silence of the prairie settled over them. Clara went inside, her mind reeling. She had just handed her husband's tools over to an Apache. She had just given him the run of her property. She built up the fire in the stove and found the pot of beans she had cooked 2 days ago. It was mostly what she lived on. She heated them and baked a fresh piece of cornbread on the griddle. Her hands were shaking. She dished out a large portion onto a tin plate. She took it and a tin cup of water from the near-empty barrel and went outside. He was sitting on his haunches by the barn wall, watching the sunset. He was as still as the rocks in the hills. She did not want to get too close. She set the plate and the cup on a large, flat tree stump that Jacob had used as an anvil. "This is all there is," she said. He looked at the food, then at her. She retreated to the porch, her own small plate of beans in her hand. She sat on the top step, as far from him as she could get while still being outside. They ate in the twilight, separated by 30 yards of dusty ground and 1,000 years of history. He ate slowly, methodically. He did not shovel the food in like a starving man, though he must have been. He ate with a deliberation that was almost graceful. When he was finished, he drained the cup of water. He stood. He walked across the yard, the empty plate and cup in his hand. He stopped at the bottom of her steps. He was close enough now that she could see the detail of the bruises on his face, the weariness in his eyes. He held out the plate and cup, and then he spoke. "Thank you." His voice was a low rasp, rough with disuse, but it was clear and resonant. It was English, perfectly understandable. The sound of it shocked her more than the auction, more than the walk, more than the removal of the ropes. It was the voice of a man, a human being. She found herself unable to move, unable to take the plate. She nodded, her throat tight. "You are welcome." She found her own voice, and it was thin. "My husband, Jacob, he built this place. He thought the land had promise." She did not know why she said it. Perhaps to explain the mess, perhaps to explain herself. Talon looked away from her, toward the darkening fields. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. "My family had land, by a river. The soldiers came." He said nothing more. He did not need to. The chasm between them suddenly felt a little less wide. It was a bridge built of shared, unspeakable loss. A chill crept into the air. The first stars were appearing. "You can sleep in the barn," Clara said, finally taking the plate from him. Their fingers brushed. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "There is clean hay in the loft. It is dry." He nodded, and without another word, he turned and walked back to the barn, disappearing into its black, square mouth. Clara went inside. She locked the door. a flimsy bolt that would not stop anyone. She stood in the dark of her kitchen, her hands braced on the table. She was trembling. She had spent all her money. She had brought a stranger, a savage, according to her neighbors, into her home. The rumors would be flying in Dry Creek. She could almost hear them. The widow Whitford, alone on her ranch, with that heathen. They would be sharpening their judgment, their fear, their hatred. She was exhausted, and she was terrified. But as she stood there, listening to the night sounds, the cry of a distant coyote, the settling of the old house, she felt something else, a strange, unfamiliar feeling. She had not felt it since before Jacob's death. It was the barest, faintest possibility of peace. She had made a decision. It was her own, and for the first time in a year, she was not entirely alone. The sun rose the next morning on a different ranch. It was the same broken down, dust-choked land, but the equation of its inhabitants had changed. Clara awoke before dawn, a habit of her lonely existence. Her first thought was a jolt of pure, cold panic. What have I done? The events of the previous day rushed back, not as a heroic stand, but as a series of catastrophic financial and social errors. She had spent every cent. She had invited ruin. She had brought a man the town considered a dangerous animal into her home. She dressed in the gray light, pulling on her work skirt and boots, her hands trembling. She expected silence. She expected to walk out onto the porch and find him gone, vanished back into the hills. Her $70 a mere memory of her foolishness. Instead, she smelled wood smoke. She hurried to the kitchen, her heart in her throat. The door was unlocked, just as she had left it. Through the window, she saw him. He was not in the barn. He was by the dead garden patch. He had a small, neat fire going, and he was straightening the blade of a shovel, heating it in the coals and tapping it true with a hammer on a flat rock. He was already working. Clara went out onto the porch. The air was cool, the only kind part of the day. He did not look up immediately. He finished his task, his movements economical and certain. He tapped the metal, sighted down its edge, and then, satisfied, he plunged the blade into the earth to cool. Only then did he stand and look at her. He was a different man from the one at the auction. The bruises were still stark and purple on his skin. His lip was still split, but he was no longer a victim on a block. He was a man on her land. He wore a pair of Jacob's old work trousers, which she had folded and left on a bench in the barn the night before. They were too short, but they were serviceable. He was bare-chested, and she could see the lean, ropey muscles of his back and shoulders, the old, pale scars of a life she could not imagine. "The pump," he said, his voice that same quiet rasp. He gestured with his chin toward the well. "The leather is cracked. It draws air." Clara just nodded, unsure what to say. She had been fighting that pump for 6 months. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was entirely new. It was a rhythm of two. It was the rhythm of work. Talon, as she had heard the soldiers call him, though she had not yet dared to use any name for him, began at the well. He dismantled the entire pump head, laying the heavy iron pieces out on a piece of canvas. Clara watched him, terrified he was breaking the last, fragile heart of the ranch. But he worked with the patient skill of a surgeon. He used Jacob's tools as if they were his own. He cut a new gasket from a piece of boot leather he found in the barn. He greased the mechanism with rendered lard from her kitchen. He worked for hours, his focus absolute. When he reassembled it and motioned for her to try, she pumped the handle, and the sound was different. The shriek was gone. It was a solid, reassuring thunk, thunk, and the water, after a moment, ran clear. It was not a gush, but it was a steady, honest stream. It was the first good thing that had happened on the ranch in a year. Clara looked at him, her face stunned. "How did you—" He just nodded toward the mechanism, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. From the well, he moved to the fences. He did not bother mending the rotten posts. He ripped them out of the ground. He found a new stand of cedar in a dry creek bed 2 miles away, and he began felling them, cutting them to length, and hauling them back, 2 at a time, on his shoulders. Clara, shamed by his relentless energy, found her own. She could not stand by and watch. She grabbed the post-hole digger, and they worked together. He would set the posts, his eye for a straight line, perfect and unwavering. She would follow behind, stretching the wire, her hands raw and bleeding, her muscles screaming in protest. They did not talk. The silence between them was as wide and spare as the land itself. It was filled with the sound of the axe, the grunt of effort, the sharp zing of wire being stretched, the thud of the hammer. In the barn, he was just as methodical. He salvaged boards from a collapsed shed, and, in a single day, he was up on the roof, patching the hole. Clara stood below, handing him the boards, handing him the nails. She watched the way he moved, with a balance that was almost beautiful, a total lack of wasted motion. Their meals were the same. She would cook beans and cornbread, or a thin rabbit stew when Talon returned from checking a line of snares he had set. They ate on the porch, as they had that first night, he on the stump, she on the steps. One evening, as the sky bled orange, she found her voice. "The land," she said, gesturing to the patched garden, which he had now fenced against rabbits. "It is so dry. Jacob, my husband, he thought he could beat it." Talon finished his mouthful. He looked at the hard, cracked earth. "The land does not fight," he said, his voice quiet. "It remembers. It waits for a careful hand." His words settled in her heart. He was not just talking about farming. 4 days after the auction, a wagon approached. Clara saw the dust cloud, and her hand immediately went to the shotgun Jacob had kept loaded with rock salt, just inside the door. She had moved it there the day after the auction, a silent declaration that her porch was now a border. Talon, who had been rehanging the heavy barn door, simply melted back into the shadows, a hammer in his hand. But the wagon was not Morrison's. It was the rickety buckboard of Lars Olsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had a small, failing farm 5 miles to the north. His wife, Greta, sat beside him, a shawl wrapped tight around her head. Clara walked out to meet them, her hand still tingling from the wood of the shotgun. Greta Olsen was a big woman with a face as weathered as the land, but her eyes were kind. She held out a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Mrs. Whitford." "Clara," she said, her accent thick. "We was in town. We heard—" Clara took the bundle. It was heavy. "Mrs. Olsen, You open," she commanded. Inside was a 5-pound sack of flour, a twist of paper filled with salt, and a small tin of seeds. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She had been so braced for hatred that kindness undid her completely. I cannot pay you for this." "This is not for paying," Lars said, his voice a deep rumble. He was a huge man with a shy, sad-eyed face. "Is for neighbors. We know hard. We know Morrison. Is not right." Greta's eyes flickered to the barn, where Talon was now visible, standing in the shadows, watchful. Greta nodded at him. A simple acknowledgement, woman to man. "This is good land," she said. "Has good bones. My Lars says, like your man." Clara flushed, not knowing what to say. But the Olsens' visit was a small, bright light in the oppressive darkness. It was a reminder that the town was not a monolith. There were other people on the margins, people who understood. 2 days after that, another writer. This time it was official. Sheriff McKenna. Clara stood on the porch again. The shotgun was leaning against the wall. Plain to see. Talon was on the far side of the corral, working with a half-wild colt, his movements slow and gentle, murmuring to the animal in a language Clara could not understand. "Mrs. Whitford," McKenna said, not dismounting. He looked tired, and his eyes kept straying to Talon. "I am just making my rounds." "Are you, Sheriff?" Clara said, her voice cool. "The town is unsettled, ma'am. There are a lot of folks worked up. Reverend Blackwood preached a sermon on Sunday about temptation and heathens. I am not concerned with Reverend Blackwood's sermons. I am concerned with my fence line, which is now fixed." McKenna nodded, looking at the new cedar posts, straight as a line of soldiers. "I see that." He looked at Talon, who had not stopped his work with the colt. "He has not caused any trouble. He has done nothing but work. He has fixed my well. He is mending my barn. He is breaking my colt. He is the only person who has brought anything but trouble to this ranch in a year." McKenna sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Clara, you have to understand. Dale Morrison is not a man who forgives. He is not a patient man. He owns the note on this place. I am aware of my debts. Sheriff, he feels you made a fool of him. You bought that. You bought him." He gestured at Talon. "Right out from under his nose. He wanted to make an example. Now, he will want to make an example of you." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It is a warning," McKenna said gruffly. "You are a woman alone, and you are not alone anymore, and that just makes it worse in their eyes. Be careful. Lock your doors." He turned his horse and rode away, a man trying to keep the peace in a place that did not want it. The confrontation, when it came, was not 2 days later. It was that very afternoon. Clara was in the house, kneading dough with the last of her old flour, saving Greta's gift, when she heard the horses. Not one, but 3. She looked out the window. Her stomach dropped into her boots. Dale Morrison, with Cal and Ike Harmon, was riding up her road. She stepped out onto the porch, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would break her ribs. The shotgun felt impossibly heavy as she picked it up, but she held it, its butt resting on the porch floor, the barrel pointed at the sky. Talon had seen them. He was crossing the yard from the corral, the hammer he had been using to fix a railing still in his hand. He did not run, he did not hide, he did not go to the barn for a weapon. He simply walked, his pace steady, until he reached the porch. He did not stand in front of her. He stood just behind her and to the side, his presence a solid, silent wall at her back. Morrison reined in his horse just outside the newly mended gate. He did not get down. He smiled, that big, friendly, false smile. The Harmon brothers flanked him, their hands resting on their pistols, their expressions sullen and mean. "Clara, my dear," Morrison called out, his voice booming with false concern. "I was just riding by, and I was so worried about you." Clara hated it when he used her first name. "It is Mrs. Whitford, and I am fine. What do you want?" Morrison's smile tightened just a fraction. He saw Talon. "Well, I see you have put your purchase to good use. But the talk in town, Clara, it is terrible. They are saying you are in danger, that this savage might, you are a woman alone. They are saying you are vulnerable." "I am perfectly safe, Mr. Morrison." "Are you?" Morrison's gaze was an insult. "Because I'm a generous man. I am still willing to help. That banknote is coming due. You have no income. You spent your last dollar on him." He pointed at Talon. "A foolish, emotional purchase. But I will overlook it. I will take him off your hands, put him to work in my mine, where he belongs, and I will cancel your debt. And, as a bonus, I will give you $500, cash for this land. You can go back east, go back to your family." Clara's hand was white on the shotgun. "I am not selling. This is my home, and he is not for sale." Morrison laughed, a short, ugly sound. "It is an it, Mrs. Whitford, a thing, and you are making a terrible mistake." His voice went cold. "She told you to leave." The voice came from the South Trail. "Sheriff McKenna." He must have doubled back, expecting this. He rode his horse to stand between Morrison's men and Clara's gate. Morrison's face turned dark, his mask of friendliness gone. "This is a private, financial matter. Sheriff." "This looks like armed intimidation. Dale," McKenna said, his voice flat and hard. "The lady is on her own property. She has not broken any law. Her employee has not broken any law. You are trespassing. I'm advising you to go home." Morrison stared at McKenna, and then at Clara. His eyes were like chips of ice. He looked at Talon, who had not moved, his grip on the hammer steady, his gaze fixed on Morrison. "You will regret this, widow," Morrison hissed. It was the same threat, but it carried more weight now. He wheeled his horse around. So sharp the animal reared. "Come on!" He spat at the Harmons. They rode away, kicking up a cloud of angry dust. The silence that fell was more profound than any yet. Clara felt her knees buckle. She sagged against the porch post, the shotgun suddenly too heavy to hold. Talon did not move for a long moment. Then he stepped off the porch, walked to the woodpile, and, with a single, clean, violent motion, he split a log with the hammer. That night, the house felt small and besieged. The flimsy lock on her door was a joke. The barn was too far, too exposed. She made their supper. She took his plate, but he was not in the barn. He was not on the stump. He was sitting on his haunches, in the deep shadow between the well and the house, simply watching. A sentry. She walked out to him. "You cannot stay out here," she said, her voice shaking. "It is not safe." He looked up at her, his face a mask of shadows. "For you," she clarified, though she was not sure she meant it. "They will come back. They will come for you." She took a deep breath, the decision forming as she spoke it. "There is a room, inside, off the kitchen. It was a pantry. It is small, but it is dry, and the door is strong." He stood. He was taller than she realized. He looked at the house, then at her. "Come," she said. He picked up his plate and followed her inside the house for the first time. She showed him the small, windowless room. It had a narrow cot. She had put one of Jacob's old blankets on it. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the cot. He looked at the solid wood of the door. Then he looked at her. He understood what this meant. She was moving him from an outbuilding to the fortress. She was bringing him inside. It was the ultimate gesture of trust, born not of friendship, but of a shared, desperate fight. He gave that single sharp nod. Clara went to her own room. At the far end of the house, she shut her door. She slid the bolt, but the fear was different now. It was not the fear of the man in her house. It was the fear of the world outside, and the knowledge that, for the first time since Jacob's death, there was another human being on her side of the wall. The truce of the small, dark hours was broken by the sound of horses. It was not a single rider, like McKenna, or the arrogant, measured approach of Morrison's trio. This was the shuffling, nervous sound of a group, a crowd on horseback, trying and failing to be quiet. Clara was awake instantly, her body rigid, her ears straining. The moon was down, and the house was steeped in a blackness so complete it felt like a weight. She slipped out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards. She grabbed her robe, her heart a frantic bird in her chest. She hurried to the kitchen. The door to Talon's small room was already open. He was not there. She saw him, a shadow against the lesser shadow of the kitchen window, standing perfectly still, watching. He had heard them long before she had. "How many?" she whispered. 10, maybe 12, he answered, his voice a low rumble, devoid of any fear, only calculation. "They ride like farmers, not fighters, but they are carrying fire." Fire! The word hit her like a stone. She looked out the window and saw it. Not flames, but a dull, moving, orange glow. Torches. Blackwood, she said, the name tasting like ash. She turned, her fear suddenly hardening into a cold, brittle anger. She went to the front door and took the heavy shotgun from its place. She checked the load, as Jacob had taught her. 2 shells, rock salt. She had no desire to kill, but she would not be burned out. She stepped out onto the porch. Talon was right behind her, a dark, silent presence. He held the axe from the woodpile, its handle short, its blade sharp. He did not stand on the porch with her, but remained in the open doorway, a guardian of the threshold. The riders fanned out in a half-circle in her yard, just beyond the light of their own torches. The light was hellish, casting long, dancing shadows, making the men look like devils. At their head, on a tall gray horse, sat Reverend Blackwood. He was not carrying a torch. He was carrying his Bible, holding it aloft like a weapon. "Mrs. Whitford," he called out, his voice thin and sharp with righteousness. "Clara, we have come as friends. We have come as your Christian neighbors, to save your soul." The men behind him murmured their agreement. She recognized a few of them. Men who sat in his pews on Sunday. Men who owed Morrison money. Men who were quick to anger and slow to think. "It is a late hour for a social call. Reverend?" Clara said, her voice shaking but loud in the pre-dawn stillness. The shotgun remained at her side, the barrel pointed at the porch boards. "Or is this an early one?" "This is the hour of temptation," Blackwood declared, his voice rising to a preacher's cadence. "You have taken an abomination into your home, a heathen, a creature of the wild. You have brought sin under your roof, woman, and you have shamed this decent community. What I have in my home is a man I saved from your bloodthirsty justice." Clara shot back. "A man who has done nothing but work. He has mended my well. He has fixed my fences. He has shown me more decency than any man in that crowd." "Decency," Blackwood spat. "You are alone with him. Do you think we are fools? You have sacrificed your virtue, your good name, and your immortal soul for this savage—" "I am a widow, Reverend, not a fool," Clara said, her voice dropping, each word a carefully placed stone. "I know what this is. This is not about my soul. This is about Mr. Morrison's pride. You are his errand boy, and you have brought these men here with torches. What kind of God-fearing men?" She raised her voice, the question directed at the men behind him. What kind of men bring torches to a lone woman's house before dawn? A nervous shuffle went through the riders. A few of them looked down, their face hot in the torchlight. She had hit the mark. They were here for a righteous scolding, not an ugly crime. Blackwood saw he was losing them. His face, pale and strained, twisted in anger. "She is defiant. She is lost to sin. The house of God must be cleansed." "Maybe a fire is what she needs," shouted a voice from the back. Clara recognized it. It was one of the men who always drank with the Harmons. Before Clara could react, the man spurred his horse forward, his arm pulling back. He flung his torch in a high, spinning arc. It was not aimed at the house. It was aimed at the barn. The torch landed with a dull thump on a pile of dry hay Talon had left near the barn door after mending the stalls. The hay ignited with a terrifying, instantaneous whoosh. A wall of yellow flames shot up, licking at the dry, ancient wood of the barn. "No!" Clara screamed, raising the shotgun. But Talon was already moving. He was not a man. He was a streak of shadow. He was out the door and across the yard in 5 silent, loping strides, before the man who threw the torch had even reined in his horse. He did not run for water. There was no time. He grabbed a heavy horse blanket that had been airing on the corral fence. He did not slow down. In one fluid motion, he ran at the flames and leaped, using his body and the blanket to smother the fire against the barn wall. He went down into the heart of the blaze, disappearing for a sickening second. The men shouted, a gasp of collective shock. Then he rose, like a phoenix from the smoking, blackened hay. The blanket was smoldering. His hair was singed, but he was untouched. He stood, his chest heaving, and threw the blackened blanket to the ground. He turned, his face a mask of cold fury in the torchlight, and stared at the man who had thrown the fire. He still held the axe. Not a single man in the posse moved. They had just witnessed something they could not understand. It was not a savage. It was a warrior, calm, efficient, and absolutely fearless. The man who had thrown the torch suddenly looked very pale and very alone. Reverend Blackwood, his face white with rage and humiliation, knew he was beaten. His mob had been cowed, not by a gun, but by a simple act of courage. This is not over," he stammered, pulling his horse's head around. "The Lord's work is not finished if the law of man will not cleanse this place. The law of God will—" He kicked his horse and galloped away, his posse of shamefaced, frightened men scattering after him, their torches leaving a trail of smoke in the growing light. Clara stood on the porch, her entire body shaking so violently she could barely hold the shotgun. The sun was just beginning to touch the eastern horizon, revealing the ugly, smoking black scar on the side of her barn. Talon did not come back to the porch. He walked, his pace steady, to the well. He grabbed the bucket and began pumping water. He walked to the barn and doused the smoking hay and the wall and the ground around it. He did not stop until every last spark was dead. He left the axe by the woodpile and went to the corral to check on the horses, who were stomping and whinnying in terror. His movements were calm, as if he had just spent the morning mending a fence. Clara finally lowered the shotgun, her arms aching. The news of that morning's confrontation spread through Dry Creek faster than the fire itself. But the story had changed. The Olsons rode over that afternoon, their faces grim, and left a side of bacon. Mrs. Olson had tears in her eyes as she hugged Clara. "You are in danger, child," she had whispered. But other stories were spreading. Stories of a heathen who put out a fire with his bare hands while Christian men ran away. Stories of Reverend Blackwood's posse looking foolish and cruel. In town, Tom Bradley heard the story from his father, who had heard it from a shaken member of the posse. Tom felt that same hot shame from the auction, but this time it was mixed with a strange, grudging admiration for the widow and her silent protector. The town was still against her, but it was no longer a solid, unified block. There were cracks. That evening, the silence in the small house was different. It was not a silence of work or of grief. It was the silence of a fortress after a failed assault. They were both alive. The ranch was, for the most part, unharmed, but they both knew it was just the first clumsy attack. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. She was staring at the wall, at the place where Jacob's gun belt hung. He had been so proud of it. A Colt Peacemaker, pearl-handled. A gentleman's gun. He had called it. He had been a terrible shot. He had hated violence. He had worn it because other men wore them, and he had wanted to fit in. Clara had cleaned it and loaded it after his death, and hung it on the wall. A relic of a man she no longer fully understood. Talon was sitting on the porch step, just outside the open kitchen door, sharpening the axe blade with a whetstone. The shing, shing, shing sound was methodical, calming. Clara stood up. She walked to the wall. She took the gun belt down. The leather was supple. The brass cartridges gleamed. It was impossibly heavy. She walked to the door and stood, looking at his back. He stopped his work, the silence sudden. He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. She held the gun belt out. "I am a good shot with a shotgun," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But only at 10 paces, and only if the target is standing still. Jacob, he was not good with this, but I think you are." He stood, slowly, and faced her. He looked at the gun, then at her face. He saw no fear in her. He saw no hesitation. He saw a decision. This was not a gift. It was a commission. She was handing him the power of life and death, not just for himself, but for her and for the ranch. It was an act of trust so profound in this time and place. It was almost madness. It was an act that could get them both hanged. He did not reach for it. He held her gaze. "They will see this," he said. "I want them to," Clara said. "I want them to see that we are not afraid, that this house is protected." He looked at the pearl handle. A rich man's fancy. Then his hand closed over the worn leather of the belt. He did not take it from her. He simply held it with her, for a moment. "My people," he said, his voice very low. "We do not forget a debt, or a gift." He took the belt from her. He did not put it on. He looped it, the holster heavy at the end, and carried it with him to the stump. The next day, just after noon, she heard the shots. She was in the garden, trying to work the hard soil, to plant the seeds Greta Olson had given her. The sound made her jump. Pop, pop, pop. Slow, measured, a pause. Pop, pop, pop. Faster, a different cadence. She shaded her eyes and looked toward the small arroyo at the far end of her property. A thin wisp of blue smoke rose. He was practicing. The sound was not frightening. It was the opposite. It was the sound of competence. It was the sound of a man who knew his tools. She turned back to the hard, dry earth, and for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. She plunged the spade into the soil. That night, they sat, as had become their new custom. She was on the porch step, mending the blanket Talon had used to fight the fire. He was on the stump, the Colt dismantled on a clean rag on his knees. He was cleaning it by the light of her lantern, his movements deft and certain. The air was comfortable between them. The sharing of danger and the passing of the gun had burned away the last of the master-servant pretense. They were just two people, in a house, surrounded by enemies. He loved this land, Clara said, her voice quiet, not looking up from her needle. Jacob, he would stand on this porch, after a whole day of failing, and he would say, "It has good bones. Clara, the bones are good." He was a man of words, not actions. Talon stopped his work. He was polishing the barrel, and he sighted down it, toward the dark prairie. "My wife," he said. Clara's needle stopped. He had never spoken this way before. Her name was Ayana. She taught the children the songs. She was making a cradle board for our son when the soldiers came. He paused, and his voice was flat, without emotion, just a statement of fact. She thought words could stop them. She walked out to them, her hands open, to tell them they were on sacred ground. They did not listen to her words. Clara's eyes blurred. She did not weep for him. She wept with him. It was the same story. The story of good people who believed the world was better than it was, and the people they left behind who had to learn the truth. He began reassembling the pistol. The clicks of the metal parts sliding together were sharp, precise, and final in the night air. He spun the cylinder, click, 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 and slid the gun back into its holster. He stood and looked at her, the lantern light carving shadows on his bruised face. "We will not make that mistake," he said. It was a promise. Clara nodded and pulled her thread tight. The stitch was made. The alliance was sealed. The change was not in the land, but in the air between them. The work continued. The fence was now a straight, strong line, a scar of new wood against the prairie. The garden, fenced and watered from the mended well, showed the first, impossible-seeming traces of green. They worked from the first light of dawn until the last purple light of dusk, a silent, two-person engine of restoration. Talon was training the colt, his voice a low, constant murmur as he moved with the animal in the small corral. He did not break the horse. Clara realized. He seemed to be persuading it. Clara, meanwhile, was in the house, a place he still rarely entered beyond the small kitchen. She was baking, using the flour Greta Olson had given her. The smell of fresh bread was a defiant act, a scent of life in a house that had smelled only of dust and grief. She was taking the loaves from the oven when she smelled it, a different smoke. Not the good, clean scent of her cedar wood fire. This was the acrid, panicked smell of something huge and uncontrolled. She ran to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. "Talon!" He was already standing outside the corral, his head up, sniffing the wind. He pointed to the northeast, toward the Garrett farm. A thick, oily column of black smoke was boiling into the clear blue sky, rising and then flattening out in the wind. It was not a chimney fire. It was a disaster. "The barn," he said, his voice flat. Clara did not hesitate. "Saddle the mare. I will get the water bag." He did not argue or question. He moved to the barn. She ran back inside, grabbing the big canvas water bag she kept for emergencies, and a small tin of the salve she used for rope burns. She pulled on her bonnet, her hands shaking. It was happening again. Fire, the town's weapon. But when she came out, Talon was not just saddling the mare. He had also bridled the half-broken colt. He threw a blanket on its back. "No," he said, seeing her look. "You ride the mare. I ride him. Faster." It was a statement, not a request. He swung onto the colt's bare back, his knees high, his balance perfect. The animal sidestepped, nervous at the smell of smoke, but Talon's hands on its neck, his low voice, calmed it. He had the Colt pistol secured at his hip. Clara mounted the mare, and they rode. They flew across the dry prairie, not on the road, but cutting straight across the land, Talon leading the way. He rode the half-wild colt as if he had been born on its back. They arrived in a cloud of dust and chaos. The Garrett's barn was not just burning. It was an inferno. The roof was gone, a raging volcano of flame and black smoke. Half the town was already there, drawn by the same terrible pillar in the sky. Men were shouting, forming a useless bucket brigade from the well, the water hissing into steam before it even touched the flames. Paul Garrett, his face a mask of soot and terror, was trying to fight his way back into the barn, screaming about his horses. Other men were holding him back. And then Clara heard the sound that cut through the roar of the fire and the shouting of the men. It was a woman's shriek, a sound of pure, animal terror, high and thin and constant. "Emma, my baby! Oh God, my God! She is in the loft, Emma!" Martha Garrett was on her knees in the dirt, her hands tearing at her hair, her eyes fixed on one small square window high up in the barn's gable end. The hayloft door. A horrified silence fell over the men. The bucket brigade stopped. They all looked up at that window. Smoke was pouring from it, thick and black. "The inside ladder burned through," Paul Garrett roared, breaking free of the men. "I tried, I cannot get to her." He ran at the barn wall, clawing at the boards, his hands raw. The crowd was frozen. They were watching a child die. Clara saw Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile, her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She saw Tom Bradley and his father, Dr. Bradley, who had just arrived in their buggy. Tom looked sick. Clara turned, her heart in her throat, looking for Talon. He was gone. Then she saw him. He was not frozen. He was moving with that same terrifying, focused calm. He had run to the water trough, where the bucket brigade was working. He shoved men aside, grabbed a heavy horse blanket from the fence, and plunged it into the water. He hauled it out, dripping, and threw it over his head and shoulders, like a cape. He grabbed a long ladder that was lying useless on the ground, one of the long ladders for stacking hay. "Here," he yelled, his voice a sharp, clear command that cut through the panic. Paul Garrett and two other men, stunned into obedience, ran to help him. They slammed the ladder against the side of the burning building. It was too short. The top rung was a good 6 feet below the loft door. "It will not reach," Paul Garrett screamed, his voice cracking. Talon did not answer. He was already climbing. He went up the ladder, hand over hand, as the crowd watched, breathless. He reached the top rung. He was still too far below. He tested the rung, then braced his moccasined feet. He crouched, and then he leaped. He grabbed the burning, splintered sill of the loft door, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching under his wet shirt. He hauled himself up, his legs kicking for purchase, and disappeared into the solid black wall of smoke.
"Oh, God,"
Clara whispered. Her hands clasped so tightly her nails bit into her palms. Martha Garrett stopped screaming. She just watched, her mouth open, silent. The wait was an eternity. It was 10 seconds. It was a lifetime. The roar of the fire was the only sound. "He is not coming out," someone whispered. "He is dead." Then a shape appeared in the black square. It was Talon. He was coughing, a terrible, racking sound. The blanket was gone. He was holding a small, limp bundle. The child. He stood framed in the fire, his hair singed, his shirt smoking. He looked down. The crowd looked up. "Catch!" he shouted, his voice a raw croak. He did not throw her. He held her out as far as he could and let her drop. The small shape, wrapped in what Clara now saw was Talon's own wet shirt, fell. Paul Garrett was there, his arms outstretched. He caught his daughter with a strangled sob, stumbling back, clutching her to his chest. The girl, Emma, was coughing, then crying, a thin, beautiful wail. She was alive. A ragged cheer went up from the crowd, a sound of disbelief and release. But Talon was still trapped. The flames were licking at the doorway now, framing him completely. The ladder was impossibly far below. He did not hesitate. He put his hands on the burning sill. Clara saw the quick, sharp wince of pain and vaulted. He pushed off, out and away from the wall, twisting in midair. He landed hard, feet first, then rolled, a plume of dust and steam rising from his body as he hit the ground. He did not stay down. He came up on one knee, his head bowed, breathing in great, ragged gasps. The crowd was silent. They just stared. Martha Garrett was the first to move. She ran from her husband, who was weeping over their daughter. She ran to Talon. She fell to her knees in the dirt in front of him. This half-naked savage man. She grabbed his head, his singed hair, and pulled his face to her chest, sobbing. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. God bless you. You saved my child. God bless you." She was incoherent. Talon, his face a mask of soot and pain, looked startled, lost. He patted her back, a clumsy, awkward gesture with a hand that was visibly burned, the skin red and raw. Martha pulled back, looked at his face, at the soot, at the pain, and she kissed his cheek. A full, public, mother's kiss of gratitude. Then Paul Garrett was there, holding his daughter, who was peering over his shoulder at Talon with wide, terrified, fascinated eyes. Paul, a man who had been in Blackwood's posse, a man who had called for Talon's hanging. He stood in front of Talon, and the big rough farmer was weeping, tears cutting clean paths through the soot on his face. He held out his free hand. "Sir, Mr. I do not know your name." Talon looked at the offered hand, then at Paul Garrett's face. He pushed himself to his feet, wincing. "Talon," he said, his voice rough. "Talon." Paul Garrett nodded, swallowing. I was wrong. I was a fool. I said things. I am sorry." He held his hand out further. "I owe you my daughter's life. I owe you everything." Talon looked at the hand. He looked at his own, the skin blistered and raw. After a long second, he gripped Paul Garrett's hand. It was a handshake that changed the town. Mrs. Patterson was fanning herself, her face the color of ash. "Well," she whispered to the woman next to her, "I never, in all my days, he went right in like an angel." Tom Bradley was just staring, his mouth open, his eyes shining with pure, unadulterated admiration. Sheriff McKenna walked over, his face grim but his eyes clear. He looked at the smoking wreck of the barn, then at the small family reunited, then at Talon. He stopped beside Clara, who was rooted to the spot, her own face wet with tears she had not realized she was shedding. "Mrs. Whitford," McKenna said, his voice low. "Not every man would have done that. Not a white man, not any man, not a one of them in that crowd. That is a man of courage." He was, in his own way, shifting his own allegiance, from the letter of the law to the spirit of justice. Dr. Bradley was already at work, checking Emma, who was scared and choked with smoke, but unharmed. Then he turned, his black bag in his hand, and walked to Talon. "Let me see those hands. Son," he said, his voice all business. Talon was standing, swaying slightly, his face pale beneath the soot. He held out his hands. They were bad. The palms were scorched, the skin split. The doctor clicked his tongue. "And your face?" There was a long burn along his cheekbone, where the flames had licked past his covering. "This is going to hurt," the doctor said. He began to clean the wounds, applying salve and wrapping them in clean white linen. Talon stood, his jaw set, not making a sound. The word hero was being whispered. Not savage, not heathen, not Apache. Hero. The baptism of fire had washed away the old labels, at least for a day. That evening, back at their ranch, the sun set in a blaze of red that matched the raw skin on Talon's hands. He was sitting at the kitchen table. He had not been invited. He had just walked in and sat, as if he knew he now belonged there. The doctor's bandages were already soaked through. Clara brought the basin of clean, cool water. She put it on the table. She had a bottle of whiskey. "The doctor said this is for the pain," she said, her voice shaking. She poured him a glass. He took it with his left hand, his good hand, and drank it in one swallow, his eyes closing briefly. She sat opposite him. "Let me," she said. He held out his hands. Her own were trembling so badly she could hardly work. She gently unwrapped the linen, her breath catching at the angry, weeping blisters. He had done this for a stranger's child. She dipped a clean cloth in the water and began to wash away the soot and the doctor's salve, which was gritty with dirt. Her touch was whisper light. He hissed, the muscles in his jaw bunching, but he did not pull away. She worked in silence, her head bowed, focusing on the wounds, on the skin, on the simple, terrible, intimate act of care. She cleaned the burn on his cheek, her fingers brushing his skin, his singed hair. He watched her, his dark eyes unreadable in the lantern light. But the tension was gone. He was in her house, at her table, and she was tending to his wounds. The barrier between them, the one of master and servant, of white and Indian, had been burned away. All that was left was a woman and a man, and a silence that was heavier and more freighted with meaning than any words could ever be. She finished bandaging his hands with fresh cloth, her heart hammering a slow, painful beat she did not understand. He had saved a child, and in doing so, he had, perhaps, saved them all. The fire at the Garrett farm changed more than just the barn. It changed the air. It burned away a layer of hate, and the talk in Dry Creek, which had once been a solid, bitter wind, now blew in two directions. There were still those, huddled in Reverend Blackwood's pews or drinking Morrison's whiskey, who muttered about the savage. But a new story had taken root. This story was not about a heathen. It was about a hero. 2 days after the fire, on the morning of the barn raising, this change was a palpable thing. When Clara and Talon rode up to the Garrett farm, they were not met with hostile stares. They were met with silence, and then a few hesitant nods. Talon's hands were still heavily bandaged. Clara had redressed them that morning, her touch gentle but firm, both of them wincing at the raw, weeping skin. Dr. Bradley had ordered him to do no work, but they both knew he would not, could not, stay away. He was now part of this. He had Jacob's Colt strapped to his hip, a silent, stark declaration. Paul Garrett, his face still haggard but his eyes clear for the first time in memory, walked right up to them as they dismounted. He ignored Clara for a moment and stood in front of Talon. We are grateful you came," Paul said, his voice thick. Talon, his face mostly healed from the smaller burns, just nodded, his gaze taking in the scene. The entire town, it seemed, was here. Wagons were parked everywhere. The women, led by Martha Garrett and Greta Olson, were setting up long trestle tables, loading them with pies, baked beans, and bread. The men were standing around the blackened, smoking foundation of the barn, a confused, disorganized huddle. "It is a big job," Talon said, his voice quiet. "Aye," Paul said, rubbing his neck. "And none of us a master carpenter. Just farmers, mostly." Lars Olsen came over, his big, shy face full of respect. He nodded to Talon. "Is good. You are here." Mrs. Patterson, from the Mercantile, who had once looked at Clara with such pity, now bustled over with a cup of lemonade. She offered it to Talon.
You must be thirsty, after all you did."
He took it with his unbandaged left hand, his eyes surprising her with their directness. "Thank you." The work began, and it was a mess. The men, with more goodwill than skill, were arguing over the support beams. They had the new-cut lumber, green and heavy, but no one seemed to agree on how to join the trusses to support the roof. "No, Paul, that will not hold its own weight, let alone a snow." "It is how my pappy built his arm." Paul, frustrated and sweaty, finally threw his hammer down. His gaze found Talon, who was standing by the foundation, watching, his bandaged hands resting on his hips. He was just observing, but his presence was a center of calm. "You!" Paul called out, his voice silencing the group. "You know wood. I saw you, at the widow's place, the fence, the roof." Every man turned. Talon walked over. He looked at the heavy beams, at the plans they had scratched in the dirt. He was silent for a long moment. "You are bracing it wrong," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the silence. The men bristled. "And what does an Indian know about a white man's barn?" one of Blackwood's followers muttered. Paul Garrett rounded on him. "He knows how to walk into a fire. That is more than you did. Let him speak." Talon ignored the man. He pointed at the joinery with a bandaged hand. "You are fighting the wood. The weight must be shared. Like this." He knelt, and with a piece of charcoal, he began to draw on a fresh-cut plank. He drew a diagram of a truss, a series of angles and supports that was simple, elegant, and strong. Here, and here, this is where the load rests. The men gathered around, looking at the drawing. It made perfect sense. "Well, I will be," Lars Olsen said, impressed. "My hands are not good," Talon said, looking at his bandages. "But I can show you." And he did. He became the foreman. He could not lift, but he could direct. He stood on the foundation, his voice never rising, but his authority absolute. "You and you," he said to two of the strongest farmers. "Lift that beam. No, together. Wait for the count. Good." He showed them how to notch the wood, how to join the trusses on the ground first, making them identical and strong. He showed them how to use their weight, a system of ropes and pulleys, to raise the heavy, assembled trusses into place. He was an architect, an engineer, and a leader, all in one. The men, who had been a bickering crowd, became a team. They listened to him. They followed his clear, simple directions. Tom Bradley, who had come with his father, worked like a man possessed, his eyes constantly on Talon, his face bright with the hero worship of a young man who had found a true mentor. Clara worked at the tables, her heart so full she thought it might burst. She watched him. He was not a savage. He was not a hero. He was a man, competent, quiet, and strong. He was the man Jacob had tried to be, the man he had only been in words. She saw Martha Garrett watching him too, her eyes full of a gratitude so profound it was like a prayer. Late in the afternoon, a new set of riders appeared. They did not join the work. Dale Morrison, flanked by Cal and Ike Harmon, sat on their horses on the low ridge overlooking the farm. They were a black, ugly silhouette against the bright sky. Morrison watched the scene, his face a mask. He was watching a barn being raised, but he was also watching his power crumble. He was watching the savage he had tried to buy for a mine, the man he had tried to have humiliated and broken, command the respect of the very town he, Morrison, had ruled through fear and debt. He saw Paul Garrett laugh and clap Talon on the shoulder. He saw Mrs. Patterson bring him another cup of water. He saw a community healing itself, not around him, but around this outsider. His control was slipping. The narrative was changing, and he could not stand it. He said nothing, but Clara, who glanced up and saw him, felt a chill go through her that had nothing to do with the wind. By dusk, the frame was up. The skeleton of the new barn stood tall against the purple sky, a miracle of timber and sweat. The men were exhausted, covered in sawdust and grime, but they were triumphant. Paul Garrett, his face beaming, climbed onto a wagon bed. He held up a jug of cider. "Friends, neighbors, a moment." The hammering stopped. The men gathered, wiping their brows. The women came over from the tables. Paul poured a cup and held it out, waiting until Talon, at Tom Bradley's urging, came and took it in his good hand. Paul raised his own cup. "Friends," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "2 days ago, my world was ash. I lost my way for a long time. I listened to anger. I listened to hate." He looked at the ground, then up, his gaze finding Talon. "I was blind. I said things. I thought things about a man who knew nothing about me or my family." He paused, swallowing. "But that man, he did not listen to the hate. He did not care what I thought. He only saw a child, my child, and he walked through fire to save her." The crowd was dead silent. Even the children were still. "We have built a barn today," Paul continued, his voice ringing with passion. "But we have done more. I have been given a second chance. I said I owed this man my daughter's life. I do, but I also owe him my own." He turned fully to Talon, raising his cup high. "His name is Talon Kaway, and he is no savage. He is the bravest man I have ever known. And I am proud, I am honored, to call him neighbor." He drank, a moment of stunned silence, and then Lars Olsen began to clap, his big hands a thunderous report. Then Martha, weeping and smiling, joined in, then Tom Bradley, whooping like a boy, and then the whole crowd, the men, the women, Mrs. Patterson, all of it, a wave of sound, of acceptance, of applause that washed over the farm. Talon stood, holding the cup, his face unreadable but his eyes shining in the twilight. He looked at the crowd, and then his gaze found Clara. He gave her the smallest, almost invisible nod. "We are safe." On the ridge, Morrison watched. He saw the toast. He heard the applause. His face, in the dying light, was a mask of cold fury. He had lost, he had been beaten, not by a gun, but by a gesture. He turned his horse. "Cal," he said, his voice a low, vicious hiss. "This is finished." "Boss." "The widow, the Apache, I want it finished. I tried to be reasonable. I tried to use the law. Now, we use our way? Burn them out. Not the barn. The house, tonight." "But Boss, the whole town is, Tonight, Morrison snarled. I want them gone. He spurred his horse and rode away, the Harmon brothers following, their faces grim. They were shadows, slipping away, unnoticed by the celebration below. The ride home for Clara and Talon was quiet. The sun was down, and a huge, pale moon was rising, silvering the prairie. They were both tired, a good, clean exhaustion that went to the bone. The sounds of the party, the laughter and music, faded behind them. They rode beside each other. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. It was full of shared work, shared danger, and the shared triumph of the day. They reached the small creek that marked the edge of her property, and Clara reined in the mare under the shadow of a massive, ancient cottonwood. Its leaves rustled in the night air.
I have not felt like this in a long time,
she said, her voice soft, not looking at him.
Since before Jacob. She paused. I think I felt hope.
Talon dismounted from the colt and stood by her stirrup, looking up at her. The moonlight carved his face, making the old scars shadows and the new burns faint. You are safe, Clara. He said he had used her name. It sounded new and right. She slipped from the saddle, her body aching, her heart too full. The emotion of the day, the toast, the applause, the terrifying sight of Morrison on the hill. It all washed over her. She was safe with him, yes, but the world was still out there. She stood in front of him, the moonlight catching the tears that suddenly welled in her eyes.
He was there, Morrison. I saw him. He will not stop. He will never stop.
The fear was back, cold and sharp. He will take this place. He will find a way to take you. She looked at him, at his bandaged hands, at the pistol at his hip. He will not let this rest. The words came out, a whisper, a plea, torn from the deepest part of her. Don't leave. He stood very still.
Don't leave,
she whispered again, her voice breaking.
Please, I cannot do this alone.
He did not answer with words. He smiled. It was a slow, small smile. Not the grim line she was used to, but a genuine, gentle curve of his mouth that reached his dark, shining eyes. He looked at her, and his gaze was more intimate than any touch. Until dawn, he said, his voice a low, soft rumble, a promise. I am still here. He raised his good left hand. He did not touch her, not yet. He waited. She met him, placing her trembling hand in his. His grip was warm and solid. He did not pull, he just held her. Then, slowly, he stepped closer, and he leaned in. He did not kiss her. He rested his forehead against hers. They stood like that, in the silver light, under the rustling cottonwood. For a long time, her tears dried. His hand was warm. Her hand was small in his. They just breathed. Her, the scent of wood smoke and dust, and him, the scent of soap and bread, and her, the world, the bank, the fire, the hate, all of it faded away. There was only the sound of the creek and the leaves, and the two of them, breathing, a man and a woman, finally at peace, if only for a moment. Later, on the porch, the lantern cast a small, warm circle of light. He was sitting on the stump. She was on the step. He held something out to her in his left hand. This was my grandfather's, he said. He made it. She looked. In his palm lay a small, perfect arrowhead, carved from a milky white stone. It is for you, he said, for the protector of this house. She took it from him. The stone was cool and smooth. She closed her hand around it. A small, hard piece of his past, a promise for their future. The next morning, Tom Bradley rode up, his face bright and nervous. He did not come to see Clara. He walked straight to where Talon was checking the new fence. Sir Talon, Talon turned, his face impassive.
I saw what you did at the barn raising. I mean, with the beams. And I saw you with that colt. And I heard what my father said about the tracking. When they said you stole those horses.
Tom took a deep breath. I want to learn. I do not want to be a doctor. Like my father. I want to know the land. Like you. I want to learn to track. And to ride. And to see. Talon looked at the boy. At his earnest, open face. He was young and soft, but his eyes were clear. He looked over at Clara, who was watching from the porch, the white arrowhead a cool weight in her pocket. Talon turned back to Tom. He nodded. Once. The land teaches, he said. It is a hard teacher. You must learn to listen. Tom's face split in a grin.
Yes, sir, I will.
Clara smiled. A new stitch was mending the torn fabric of their world. A new alliance. She felt the arrowhead in her pocket. Her bond with this man was no longer just survival. It was built of respect and sealed in fire. It was, she admitted, a love, quiet and strong, and grown in hard, dry ground. But as she looked down the long, empty road toward Dry Creek, she knew Morrison's shadow was still out there, and the night was coming. The false peace of the new day lasted less than an hour. Tom Bradley rode up just after sunrise, his face bright with purpose, ready for his first lesson. He found Talon and Clara on the porch, sharing a silent cup of coffee as the prairie turned from gray to gold. Talon nodded to the boy. We checked the north pasture. The grass is thin, but the horses need to move. The three of them walked, Talon setting a long, ground-eating pace, Tom almost skipping with excitement, and Clara following, a basket in her hand, intending to check for early-season berries in the arroyo. The morning was cool, beautiful, and full of promise. The promise died at the fence line. It was the new fence, the one Talon had built with his own hands, the one that had cost Clara's sweat and blood. It was not broken. It was cut. Talon stopped, his body going utterly still. Clara came up beside him, the basket dropping from her hand.
Oh, no,
she whispered. Someone had used wire cutters. 3 long sections of the wire were snipped, the new cedar posts standing like useless sentinels. The wire was coiled back, a deliberate, malicious act. Morrison. Tom spat, his face pale. Talon said nothing. He knelt, his bandaged hands hovering over the tracks in the dust. Horses, 2 riders, and cattle, he pointed. They pushed them through, hard. He stood and followed the trail, which was not a trail, but a highway of destruction. The cattle, maybe 30 or 40 head, had been driven from the cut fence, down the small gully, and straight through the center of her garden. Clara made a small, wounded sound. The garden was gone. Greta's seeds, the small, hopeful green shoots. All of it was trampled into a muddy, stinking ruin. The earth churned and fouled. It was not just destruction. It was a personal, cruel violation. It was the murder of her hope.
They did this,
Tom said, his voice shaking with rage.
They did this to be mean.
No, Talon said, his voice a low, cold monotone. He was kneeling in the ruined garden, studying the hoof prints. Not just to be mean, he pointed. Shod horses, the same 2 riders. They pushed the cattle in, and they pushed them out. They left them in your south pasture. Clara's mind, numbed by the violation, was slow.
I do not understand.
They are Morrison's cattle, Talon said. Standing, he looked at her, his eyes dark with a cold, clear understanding. They cut your fence. They drove his cattle onto your land. They destroyed your garden. Now, he will come. He will demand you pay for the cattle. He will demand you pay for their time. He will say your broken fence caused the problem. He has created a new debt, a new reason to take this ranch. The sheer diabolical cleverness of it, the twisting of the law to his own purpose, left Clara breathless. "We can tell McKenna," Tom said. "We can show him." Talon shook his head. "Show him what tracks Morrison will say it was an accident. He will say our word is worth nothing." He looked down, and his foot nudged something in the mud. He bent, and with his good hand, he picked up a small object, a half-smoked cigar, its end wet. "He is not careful," Talon said. He held it up. "This is not his brand. This is the kind the Harmon brothers buy at the saloon." He had his proof, but it was proof that would not hold up in any court. "What do we do?" Clara asked, her voice small. Talon looked at the sun, then at the house. "We fix the fence, we move the cattle, and we wait. They will come back. They will come tonight." "Why?" Tom asked. "To see the damage," Talon said, his voice hard. "Or to do more. They will not believe we can fix this so fast. They will come to laugh, or they will come to set a fire." They worked all day. It was a frantic, furious, silent labor. Talon and Tom, with Clara's help, rounded up Morrison's stray cattle and hazed them back through the cut, pushing them 3 miles north, back onto Morrison's own land. Then they began the slow, heartbreaking work of mending the fence again, their hands raw, splicing the wire back together. As the sun began to set, a different kind of preparation began. "You will not stay in the house." Talon said, "It was not a request. It is a trap. They will expect us there. Tom, you will go home." "No," Tom said, his face stubborn. "I am not leaving. I am part of this. You are teaching me. This is the lesson." Talon studied the boy and saw the man he was becoming. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Then you will do exactly as I say. You will not be a fighter. You will be a messenger. Go to the barn. Find the signal lantern. When the time comes, you will light it and place it in the hayloft window that faces north, toward the Olson farm. Can you do this?" "Olson, why?" "He is a good man. He will see it. He will know we are in trouble. He will ride for McKenna. Go." Tom, his face pale but set, ran to the barn. Talon turned to Clara. "We will wait by the well. It is open ground. They cannot set fire to it, and they will come to it." "Why?" "Because," he said, his hand resting on the colt at his hip, "they will be thirsty, or they will want to poison it. Either way, they will come." They hid themselves in the deep shadows between the wellhead and the water trough. The moon was a pale, thin sliver, offering almost no light. The prairie was a vast, black, silent ocean. The waiting was a torment. Clara could hear her own heart, a frantic drum against her ribs. She had her shotgun, the one loaded with rock salt. Talon had Jacob's colt. An hour passed, then 2. The night grew cold. Clara was shivering, and it was not just from the temperature. Then, a sound, the soft scuff of a boot on gravel. Talon's hand touched her arm. A silent command. Still. They came from the darkness, 2 shadows, moving low and fast. They were not going to the house. They were coming straight for the well. The Harmon brothers. They moved with practiced quiet, but not quiet enough. Talon had heard them when they were still 50 yards out. They reached the well. Clara could hear them breathing. "Pour it in," Ike Harmon whispered, his voice a low growl. "Let's ruin her water, and let's go." "He said to wait," Cal hissed back. "He wants to see their faces when they find the garden. He will be here soon." "I do not like it. That Indian, he is not normal." "He is just an Indian. Now, pour it." Ike uncorked a glass bottle. Clara smelled the faint, sharp scent of lye. Talon moved. He did not shout. He did not give a warning. He simply rose from the shadows like a ghost, leveling the colt. "Drop it." Ike yelped, spinning, dropping the bottle, which smashed on the stones. Cal went for his gun. A single, deafening crack split the night as Talon fired. Cal screamed, a high, thin sound, and clutched his arm. "Clara, down!" Talon roared, shoving her behind the stone wellhead. Ike, recovering, fired back, his shot wild, the bullets singing over their heads. "Tom, now!" Talon yelled. Another shot came from Ike, this one splintering the wood of the water trough, just where Clara had been hiding. Talon returned fire, the muzzle flashes blinding in the dark, and Ike scrambled back, disappearing into the shadows near the barn. The night was suddenly full of shouting. "Get him! He is by the barn!" "He hit me, Cal. He hit me." Then a new light, a lantern, high up in the barn's hayloft. Tom had done his job. And then a new voice, booming and furious, from the road. "What in God's name is this? Drop your weapons!" Two riders galloped into the yard, holding torches high. It was Lars Olsen, his face a grim mask, and Sheriff McKenna, his shotgun in his hand. The torchlight illuminated a frozen, terrible scene. Clara, pale and shaking, peering from behind the well. Talon standing over her, the smoking Colt in his hand, his eyes scanning the darkness. And Cal Harmon, kneeling in the dust, holding his arm, his shirt black with blood. "He shot me!" Cal screamed. "The savage! He shot me! Arrest him! Sheriff!" "He was poisoning the well," Talon said, his voice cold and steady. He kicked the broken glass. Ike Harmon stepped out of the barn shadows, his hands raised. "It is a lie. We was just checking on the widow. We heard she had trouble." "Trouble you made," Talon said. He stepped forward, into the light. "You cut her fence. You drove the cattle. You were paid." "You are a liar," Cal spat. "He paid you." Talon continued, his voice relentless, speaking to Cal. "He paid you in gold to frame me for the horses. He paid you to set the torch posse. He paid you tonight to destroy her garden and poison her well. And he paid you with this." From his pocket, Talon tossed the half-smoked cigar. It landed at McKenna's feet. "Shut your mouth, you fool!" The voice came from the dark. By the front gate, a new figure stepped into the light. Dale Morrison, his face a mask of pure reptilian rage. He had a shotgun in his hands. He had been watching. "This is my town, McKenna," Morrison snarled. "And this thing has been a boil on it for too long. He has shot my man. He has corrupted this woman. I am ending this." He raised the shotgun. He was aiming it, not at Talon, but at Clara. "It all ends with you, widow." "No!" Talon yelled, moving to shield her. But before Morrison could fire, a new sound. Click, click. Clara was standing. She had dropped her own shotgun. In her hands, she held Jacob's Colt. Talon had given it to her when they took cover, pressing it into her hand. "Just in case," he had said. Her hand was rock steady. The barrel was aimed, not at Morrison's chest, but at his face. "Drop it, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice not a whisper, but a clear, cold bell. Morrison froze. He looked from her to Talon. He saw the murder in her eyes. He saw the end of his world. "This is not our way," a new voice cried. It was Reverend Blackwood, hurrying up, his nightshirt tucked into his trousers. "An abomination, the savage has them all bewitched. Look murder in a woman's eyes, arrest them. Sheriff, arrest this Jezebel, this unholy union." "Be quiet, Reverend." A woman's voice snapped. Martha Garrett, followed by her husband Paul, pushed through the shadows. They must have followed Olsen. "That woman," Martha said, "is a decent soul. And that man," she pointed at Talon, "is a hero. The only unholy thing here is the greed in your heart. Dale Morrison." "She is right," Paul Garrett said, his voice booming. "We all know what you are. Morrison. We were just too scared to say it. No more." The town, his town, was turning on him. Morrison's eyes were frantic. He saw the cold, steady barrel of Clara's gun. He saw McKenna, his face hard, his own shotgun now leveled. He saw the Olsons, the Garretts, and now Tom Bradley, all standing with Clara. He had lost. Clara held his gaze. She had the power of life and death in her hand. She could pull the trigger. She could end it. It was the revenge she deserved. "No," she said, her voice clear. She did not lower the gun, but she shifted her aim, just an inch, from his head to the sky above it. "No more killing. This ends with the law." She looked at McKenna. "Sheriff, Dale Morrison hired these men to destroy my property, to poison my well, and just now, he threatened my life. I want him arrested. I want them arrested, by the law you swore to uphold." Her moral climax was not a bullet. It was a choice. McKenna, galvanized by her courage, by the town's support, nodded. "Dale, Cal, Ike, you are under arrest." It was over. Morrison looked at Clara, his face a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. And then he did the last thing anyone expected. He dropped his shotgun, turned, and ran. He bolted into the darkness, toward the road where his carriage was hidden. "He is getting away," Tom shouted. "Let him go," McKenna yelled, moving to cuff the bleeding Cal Harmon. "Ike, hands!" As Ike put his hands behind his back, he looked at Talon. He will not forget this savage. He never forgets. Morrison's carriage wheels thundered on the road, fading into the night. He was gone. But in his haste, as he leaped into the carriage, something heavy had fallen. McKenna, after securing his prisoners, walked to the gate. He bent down and picked up a small, metal strongbox. He shook it. It clinked, a heavy sound of coin. The yard was a wreck. The torches guttered. Cal Harmon was moaning. Clara finally lowered the pistol. Her arm felt like lead. She was shaking so badly she thought her bones would come apart. Talon walked over to her. He did not touch her. He did not say, "Thank you." He did not say, "I told you so." He just stood in front of her, in the smoking, chaotic, torch-lit yard. He looked at her, at the gun in her hand, at the strength in her spine, at the terrible, beautiful choice she had just made. He looked at her, and his eyes, clear through the smoke, said it all. "My protector, my partner, my family." The sun came up on a yard that looked like a battlefield. The light, pale and unforgiving, exposed the broken lye bottle, the dark, drying blood stain from Cal Harmon's arm, the deep ruts from the carriage wheels, and the trampled mud of the garden. Sheriff McKenna had not left. He had tied Cal and Ike Harmon, bound and gagged, to the porch rail of Clara's house, a grim decoration in the dawn. Lars Olson and Paul Garrett, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion, stood guard with their own rifles, a silent, citizen-led watch. The night of terror had forged a new, unspoken militia. Martha Garrett and Greta Olson had taken Clara inside, forcing her to sit, to drink hot, sweet coffee. But she could not sit. She stood at her kitchen window, watching as Talon, his own face a mask of dried sweat and smoke, moved to the corral to calm the frantic horses. He was still wearing Jacob's colt. The first official act of the new day was the arrival of Dr. Bradley, his buggy rattling into the yard. He did not come as a friend, but as an officer of the law, to tend to the prisoners before they could be moved. He cut open Cal Harmon's sleeve, his face grim in the gray light. "The ball is clean through. You are a lucky man. Or he is a good shot." He gestured at Talon, who was now walking back from the corral. "I suspect the latter. He hit just what he was aiming for. Not a kill shot, a stop shot." Cal just groaned and cursed, his face pale. After binding Cal's arm and declaring him fit for jail, Dr. Bradley walked over to Talon. "Let me see those hands," he ordered. The bandages Clara had applied were black with grime and powder burns. The doctor unwrapped them, clicking his tongue. "You have been busy, And you, Mrs. Whitford. He called to the porch. I will need more of that clean water. And my salve. Tom, fetch my bag. Tom Bradley, who had emerged from the barn, his face smudged but his eyes blazing, ran to the buggy. He was no longer a boy playing at lessons. He had been a messenger in a war. He stood by Talon's side as his father worked, a public declaration of his allegiance. I did what you said. Talon, Tom said, his voice earnest. I lit the lantern. I was not scared. Talon looked at the boy, and a rare, brief smile touched the corner of his mouth. You were scared, he said, his voice low. You did it anyway. That is what matters. Dr. Bradley finished his work, his hands gentle. This will scar, he said, looking at Talon's palms. But you will keep the use of them. You have earned a quiet day. Not yet, Doctor, Sheriff McKenna said. He was standing over the small, black metal strongbox Morrison had dropped. He had a crowbar from Clara's barn, with the Garretts, the Olsons, and the Bradleys as witnesses. He forced the lock. It did not burst open with gold, as Clara had half expected. It opened on something far more powerful. Ledgers, a small, leather-bound book, and a packet of letters, tied with a ribbon. McKenna, his face like stone, opened the ledger. The page was a neat column of names and numbers. Clara saw Paul Garrett's name, and a figure beside it. She saw Lars Olson's name. She saw the names of half the town, beside each, a date, and the word loan, or extension, or seed. He owned us, Paul Garrett whispered, his face ashen. He did not just own the bank. He owned us. This is not the worst of it, McKenna said. He opened the smaller book. It was not a loan ledger. It was a payoff ledger. Reverend Blackwood, he read, his voice flat. $50 for discretion. Cal and Ike Harmon, $20 in gold for equine services. The horses, Clara breathed. The horses he framed Talon for stealing. It is all here, McKenna said, his voice grim. He paid them to steal his own horses, to set the time, to be witnesses. He paid them to set the fire at the Garretts. No, wait. He scanned the page. He paid them to agitate. Not to burn. That was their own edition, I expect. He held up the packet of letters. And these are from the Land Office Commissioner. It seems Mr. Morrison has been paying for advance notice of all railroad surveys, and for clerical errors that voided the claims of men who would not sell to him. He snapped the book shut. The small, gathered crowd was silent. The weight of the conspiracy, the sheer scale of the theft, settling on them. This was not a man. This was a disease that had infected the whole territory. I am issuing a warrant for the arrest of Dale Morrison, Sheriff McKenna said, his voice ringing with a new, hard authority. For fraud, for conspiracy, for attempted murder, and I'm taking these men, he gestured to the Harmons, to jail, to await a federal judge, and I will need testimony. All of you. You will have it, Sheriff, Paul Garrett said, his voice a low rumble. You will have it, in writing, signed. The shift was complete. The crowd that had gathered for a labor auction was gone. In its place was a jury, a community that had taken legal, moral responsibility for itself. That afternoon, after McKenna had marched his prisoners back to town, a strange, new quiet settled on the ranch. It was broken by the sound of wagons. It was the Garretts and the Olsons, and they were not empty-handed. They had wagon beds full of cut sod and young plants from their own gardens. We heard you had some trouble with your garden, Paul Garrett said, a shy smile on his face. You helped build our barn, Martha added, her hands on her hips. It seems only right we help plant your vegetables. They worked, all of them. Clara, Talon, Tom, the Olsons, the Garretts. They did not just repair the garden. They made it bigger. They tore out the fouled, trampled earth. They laid new, rich soil from the creek bed. They planted the new shoots. Talon, his hands bandaged, worked alongside Paul, hauling water, his movements slow but steady. It was a healing. The land, which had been a symbol of her failure, was now a symbol of their shared future. While they worked, Mrs. Patterson rode up in her husband's buggy. She was alone. She looked stiff and terrified, but determined. She walked right up to Clara, who was on her knees in the dirt. Mrs. Whitford, Clara, she said, her voice small. I have brought some things. She gestured to a crate in the buggy. Cans of peaches, bags of sugar, a new side of bacon.
That is very kind, Mrs. Patterson,
Clara said, standing, wiping her hands on her apron.
No,
the woman said, and her eyes filled with tears.
It is not. It is an apology. I treated you so poorly. I believed. I said I was a fool.
She looked over at Talon, who was showing Tom how to brace a tomato plant. He is a good man. He saved Emma. And you are a good woman. A better woman than any of us. I am deeply sorry for my part in this. Clara looked at her, at this small, frightened woman who had been a voice in the chorus of hate, and she felt no anger.
We have all been fools, Mrs. Patterson,
Clara said, and she did something she had not done in a year. She offered her hand.
Thank you for the peaches.
The town was healing, but one wound remained. The following Sunday, Clara went to town. Talon rode beside her, on the mare. He did not go to church, but sat on the bench outside the sheriff's office, the new community hub, and whittled with Tom Bradley, the colt still a quiet promise at his hip. Clara walked into the First Presbyterian Church. It was half empty. The Garretts were not there. The Olsons were not there. The Bradleys were not there. Reverend Blackwood stood at the pulpit, his face pale and sweaty. He was preaching about forgiveness, about misunderstanding, about the trials of the righteous. His voice, once a thunder of damnation, was a weak, reedy whine. No one looked at him. They looked at the floor. They looked at the empty pews. His power was gone. His sermons hollow. His influence a puff of smoke. The moral center of the town had shifted from the pulpit to the porch. Clara did not stay. She turned, walked back up the aisle, and left him to his empty words. The healing, too, took new forms. A few days later, Martha Garrett brought Emma with her to the ranch. The little girl, who had been quiet and withdrawn since the fire, was still terrified of horses. Talon was in the corral, working with the colt, which now followed him like a dog. Emma hid behind her mother's skirts. Talon saw her. He stopped his work. He did not approach her. He just leaned against the fence, near the colt, and began to hum. It was a low, rhythmic, almost monotone sound, a simple three-note melody, over and over. The colt, which had been skittish at the new arrivals, dropped its head, its ears flicking. It chewed, a sign of relaxation. Emma peeked out.
What is that?
She whispered. A song, Talon said, not looking at her.
For the horse, to tell him he is safe.
Does it work? Emma asked, taking a small step. It works. Talon said, horses do not lie, but they listen. You must tell them the truth. This song tells the truth. He began to sing, very low, a few words in his own language. It was a song about the wind, and the safe grass, and the quiet night. Emma walked, step by step, until she was at the fence. She was not looking at Talon. She was looking at the horse. Can I learn it? Talon looked at her, and his face was gentle. You are already learning, he said. That evening, the ranch was quiet. The new garden was watered. The new fence was strong. Tom had gone home. Clara and Talon sat on the porch, as was their custom, but a new, comfortable peace settled between them. The threat was gone, the immediate, suffocating threat. Clara went inside. She walked to the kitchen table, where the Colt, Jacob's gun, still lay. She had cleaned it after the confrontation, but had not put it away. It felt wrong to put it away. But now, she picked it up. She felt its weight. It had been an instrument of her terror, and then her protection, and finally, her moral strength. But it was, at its heart, a tool for killing. She walked to the small wooden cabinet by the fireplace. She opened the door. Inside was Jacob's Bible, and her wedding certificate, and a small, dried flower. She placed the gun and its belt on the empty shelf. She did not lock it. It was not a renunciation. It was an act of faith, a hope for a temporary, fragile peace. When she came back out, Talon was watching her. He knew what she had done. A week later, Sheriff McKenna rode out. He did not look like a man in a hurry. He looked like a man delivering the mail. Mrs. Whitford, Talon, he nodded to them. Just wanted to let you know. Word came from the federal marshal in Tucson. They have had word from the rurales in Mexico. It seems a man matching Morrison's description, driving a very fast carriage, crossed the border at Nogales. He is gone. He got away, Clara said, the words flat. He got away, McKenna agreed. But he is not here. His accounts are frozen. The bank is in receivership. The commissioner he bribed is in a jail in Washington. He cannot touch you. He cannot touch this ranch. He left. Clara and Talon stood on the porch, watching him ride away. Morrison was gone. The banknote was still a looming, terrible shadow, but it was a shadow they no longer had to face alone. The threat was still out there, a ghost on the horizon, but it no longer ruled their lives. The air, for the first time, felt clean. The prairie held its breath. The air, for so long tasting of dust and fear, now held the scent of rain, a distant promise on the wind. It had been a week since Morrison's escape, a week since the night of the siege. The ranch was no longer a fortress, but a hub. This afternoon, it was a celebration. It was not a party, it was something quieter, more profound. It was a gathering of survivors. The long trestle tables from the Garrett barn raising were set up in the yard. Under the shade of the mended barn, they were covered in food. Martha Garrett had brought a ham. Greta Olson, a stack of sweet, spiced cakes. Mrs. Patterson, who now visited the ranch almost daily, brought a crate of tinned peaches and pickles from her store. The community that had once gathered to watch a man be sold now gathered to share his bread. Clara moved through the small crowd, her face calm, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. She was no longer the haunted, solitary widow. She was the center of this new community, its anchor. Talon sat, not on the stump, but on the porch step, as if he had always belonged there. His hands, though still scarred, were healing, and he was whittling a small piece of cottonwood. The children of the town, once terrified of his shadow, were in a small, quiet circle at his feet. He was teaching them to make a simple whistle. Emma Garrett, her fear of him completely gone, was his most devoted shadow. She came up to him, her small hands clutched behind her back. She was shy, but determined. "Mr. Talon," she said, her voice small. He stopped his work, his dark eyes gentle. "Emma." She held out her offering. It was a corn-husk doll, crudely made, with yellow yarn for hair and a small face drawn in charcoal. It had two large, uneven wings made of chicken feathers. "It is for you," she said. "My mama helped. It is a night guardian to watch for fire. So you do not have to." The chatter in the yard stopped. Everyone was watching. Clara felt her heart swell so tight it ached. Talon looked at the doll, at its lopsided, kind face. He took it from her, his large, scarred hand impossibly gentle. He studied it with the gravity of a man receiving a crown. "It is a good guardian," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Strong wings." He looked at Emma, and his face was open, unguarded. "I will keep it by my bed. I will be safe. Thank you." Emma beamed, her small face lit from within, and ran back to her mother's arms. Paul Garrett, who was standing with Lars Olsen by the new garden, raised a cup of cider. He did not make a speech. He just looked at Talon and at Clara and nodded. "To the ranch," he said. "To the ranch," the others echoed. It was a new pledge of allegiance. The most important guest arrived an hour later, not with food, but with papers. Sheriff McKenna rode up, but he was not alone. A man in a suit, looking hot and out of place in a buggy, rode with him. "Mrs. Whitford, Talon," McKenna said, his tone all business. "This is Mr. Harris, from the bank in Tucson. He is the receiver." Clara's stomach went cold. The debt, after everything, it was still there. She wiped her hands on her apron, her newfound peace crumbling. "Ma'am," Mr. Harris said. A kind-eyed, tired man. He took off his hat and wiped his brow. "I have reviewed the late Mr. Morrison's creative bookkeeping. Your note was, indeed, coming due. He had instructed the bank to refuse any extension and to seize the property." Clara's hand went to her throat. Talon, sensing her fear, stood and came to her side. "However," Mr. Harris continued, a small smile playing on his lips, "the situation is no longer in Mr. Morrison's control. I have also heard reports from Sheriff McKenna, from a Mr. Paul Garrett, from a Mr. Lars Olsen." He gestured to Paul and Lars, who had walked over, their faces set. "We told him," Paul Garrett said, his voice a deep rumble. "We told him this ranch is not just land, it is community." "Indeed," Harris said. "They have co-signed. The entire community, it seems, has offered to stand as guarantor for your note." Clara stared at him. "What?" "They are guaranteeing your credit. Ma'am, in return, they say this ranch will, with its new management," he nodded at Talon, "and its new community support, provide more than enough to cover the debt. They speak of a new horse-breaking school, of new crops." "We will have a good harvest," Clara said, finding her voice, looking at her green, thriving garden. "So it would seem," Harris said. He held out a piece of paper. "We have drawn up a new agreement, not a cancellation, a fair loan. The payments are restructured. Based on harvest time, you have 1 full year before the first payment is due, and the interest rate is fair." Clara took the paper, her hands shaking. She looked at Paul, at Lars, at Martha and Greta. You did this?" "We are neighbors, Clara," Greta said, her voice firm. "Is what neighbors do." Clara looked at the paper, and then at Talon. He was watching her, his face calm. He understood what this meant. It was not a pardon. It was a chance, a real, honest chance. She took the pen Harris offered. "Talon," she said. He stepped to her side. Clara Whitford signed her name, and then, beside her, on the line marked for partner, Naochi Talon Kawai made his mark. When the buggy had gone, Sheriff McKenna stayed behind. He had one more piece of business. He turned to Talon. "The county," he said, "is in your debt, and we are in need of men who can see. The maps are bad, the old trails are lost, and we have no one who can read the land." Talon waited. "It is a job," McKenna said, looking him in the eye. "A county scout, to track for the sheriff's office, to map the new territories. It pays $30 a month. It is a legal recognized position with a badge. Clara's breath caught. It was more than a job. It was a citizenship. It was a place in the world, under the protection of the law he had been so long denied. Talon looked at the sheriff. He looked at the ranch. His ranch. He looked at Clara. "I will need to be here," he said, "for the planting and for the horses." "You work your own hours?" McKenna said, a small smile playing on his lips. "So long as you come when I call. Welcome to the payroll. Talon." He rode away, leaving a new, profound silence in his wake. A paid scout, a legal partner. That evening, after their friends had gone, after the tables were cleared and the yard was theirs again, Clara stood in her small, quiet living room. The lantern cast a warm, yellow light. She was holding the white arrowhead he had given her. She walked to the small shelf by the fireplace. Jacob's gun was there, silent in its cabinet, his Bible, and beside them, the small, framed photograph of his face, smiling and hopeful, from a time before the land had broken him. Clara looked at the photo, her heart full of a quiet, sad love for the man he had been, for the dream he had brought her to. She did not take the photo down. She did not dishonor his memory. She took a small tack, and just beside the frame, she gently, firmly, pressed the white arrowhead into the wooden mantle. It was not a replacement. It was an addition. The past and the present, the dream and the reality, the man of words and the man of action. They could all live here, in this house. She turned. Talon was standing in the doorway, watching her. He had seen the small ceremony. He understood. He held out his hand. She took it. They walked out onto the porch, a place that was no longer a battlefield, but a home. They stood side by side, not touching, but connected, a current of shared history running between them. The fence, the one they had mended twice, stood straight and true in the moonlight, a silver line defining their world. The garden was a dark, promising square. The barn was a solid, reassuring shadow. "The house," Clara said, her voice soft in the night air. "It has come back to us." Talon put his hand on the porch rail, the rail he had fixed. He looked out at the vast, silver prairie, his home. "No," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. "We have come back to it." They stood for a long time, the silence full and comfortable. "Tom is a good boy," Clara said, thinking of the future. "He wants to learn. He will." Talon said, "He listens. The children, they are not afraid. We can teach them how to ride, how to read." Clara looked at him, her heart full. A small school, a place for riding and reading, a place of hope. "Tom can be the first assistant," she said, a smile in her voice. He smiled back, a slow, warm smile that lit his dark eyes. The moon was high, but a pale, clear light was beginning to touch the eastern horizon. Dawn was coming, the long, dark, western night was over. Morrison was still out there, a ghost in Mexico, a whisper of a threat. The bank was still a debt to be paid. The land was still hard, and the wind was still cruel, but it did not matter. Clara looked at the man beside her. He was not a savage or a hero or a victim. He was her partner. They had faced fire and hate and the law, and they had won. Not by the gun, but by the slow, hard, patient work of building. A fence, a garden, a barn, a community. The new sun, when it came, did not rise on Dry Creek. It rose on a town that was, finally, learning to be a home. It was a new day, and the light, as it spread across the golden grass, was full of promise. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I am so curious to know where in the world you are tuning in from. Please, let me know in the comments. Share your thoughts, and let us connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the Wild West Tales channel, like this video, and if you really want to support this work, hit that hype button. It helps get this story out to more listeners, just like you.